Thank you for joining us this afternoon at our roundtable on the accountability framework. I am Leah Cruzy, board chair. Joining me are my fellow board members and colleagues, Vice Chair Jim Sandman, Secretary Ricardo Ganjam, Treasurer Chantel Wright, and Nick Rodriguez. Board member Shakura Adama Fanian is delayed and will be joining us a few minutes late. Today, our Executive Director, Dr. Michelle Walker-Davis, will facilitate our discussion to allow each of us to fully participate in this important discussion. I want to be clear that the board will not be taking a vote this afternoon. This meeting is meant to serve as an informational hearing for the public and a forum for all the board members to discuss the framework together. Not too long ago, the perception of public education in the District of Columbia didn't match the exceptional potential of our students. Rather, our system was seen by many as failing. Thanks to the hard work of many, that perception has been replaced with a commonly shared vision by city leaders, educators, and families who all believe that our students deserve an educational system that will prepare them for the lives they seek and deserve. Thanks to that hard work, we now have a beautiful array of curriculum and educational models across our city in both traditional district and in public charter schools that are keeping families in the city and fostering the innate potential of our students at all ages. The DC PCSB's school oversight is deliberate and is focused on what we, the adults, have to do to meet the ongoing educational needs of our students who are children and students who are already adults. Our students deserve this and are entitled to nothing less. We move to slide 2. Developing and implementing and evaluating schools using an accountability framework is not a new practice for DC PCSB. In fact, we have a long history of strong accountability, as you can see from this slide, dating back to the early 2000s. It's this commitment to the lifelong success of the students of the District of Columbia that has grounded and informed the revision of our accountability framework. This work on the framework started before the pandemic and even before Dr. Walker-Davis started as the executive director. And to date, our data and accountability team have spent countless hours researching, evaluating, and analyzing various accountability frameworks and metrics, in addition to working with national experts. The COVID-19 pandemic showed us that our oversight tools are nimble, but that we also have an opportunity to refine our authorizing practices and re-examine data that we use for our decision-making that it's exclusively for public charter schools. It's really important to note that there are other accountability systems, but this is the only one that evaluates every public charter school in Washington, D.C. on common metrics across student groups. It is our hope that by refining our accountability framework, we can hold ourselves and our public charter schools to a higher standard in service to our students. We do not have any public witnesses this evening. So with that in mind, I will now turn it over to Dr. Walker-Davis to facilitate today's discussion. Dr. Walker-Davis.
Thank you, Chair Cruzy, and welcome members of the board. My team and I are looking forward to having this discussion. A couple of months ago, I shared a quote at a revised accountability task force meeting from Marian Wright Edelman, whose words I find so inspiring. Education is for improving the lives of others and for leaving your community and world better than you found it. These words remind me that we have a duty to make sure every student in our community receives a quality education. I know that for the board to achieve our priorities, we need to work in partnership with schools to gain insight and to listen. In addition to an almost 2-year process of engagement on the revised accountability framework, over the past month, I've met in small groups with leaders to hear about various issues related to our oversight, accountability, policies, and the implications thereof. I've learned a lot about how we can evolve, how their work as school leaders has changed since the height of the pandemic, and what they are grappling with as leaders of our public charter schools. As you know, our organization has embarked on a racial equity journey. We use Courageous Conversations protocol to engage in dialogue about race. And the protocol helps us to engage with one another with honesty, open-mindedness, and vulnerability, to listen deeply, to better understand perspectives and acknowledge discomfort when we experience it. I have found the compass very helpful, as has our team, as a personal navigation tool that helps you know where you are and how others are showing up. And this is a good exercise that allows each of us to learn about one another and understand the sources of our emotions and actions. Okay, so I want to actually have us walk through this tool that we have found helpful as a staff. And I am going to model that and then ask each of our board members to also check in using the tool. So you will see here that we have the compass, and I will just start showing where I am right now in the compass. I would say today I am showing up in the believing and acting spaces on the compass. Believing because I do deeply believe that every student should have access and opportunity to reach their highest potential. And I see the work that we do here at the Public Charter School Board and our oversight work as contributing to that goal. In terms of acting, I will be honest that I am sitting in a different role tonight as facilitator of this conversation. So I'm really focused on what I need to do to make sure that we have a successful conversation. And in terms of the identities that I'm bringing into this discussion, I am a Black woman of Caribbean descent. And as a child of immigrants, I navigated public education in the United States as a first-generation student. I'm a first-generation college graduate. I'm a parent, and I don't think that there's a day that I don't think about what that means, particularly as a consumer, if you will, of our own public charter school sector. And I'm a longtime educator who's worked in various sectors: traditional district, charter, governmental, nonprofit. So those are the identities that are top of mind for me today. And I would invite our board members to also share how you're showing up and what identities you're bringing into the conversation. So Chair Cruzy.
Thank you, Dr. Walker-Davis. Today on the compass, I am in between believing and in thinking. I appreciate the role that you are playing today as facilitator to relieve me from the acting role a bit. This work is deeply meaningful to me, and the work that we need to do to ensure an accountability framework of this next version meets the moment, requires me to engage intellectually. So I know that I'll be kind of toggling back and forth between those two. My identities: I am a woman of mixed race, Asian and white. On one side, my parent came to this country as a child, and on the other side, I can trace to the Mayflower. So I recognize that I'm the byproduct, and I benefited greatly from the hard-fought educational gains that my family on both sides have made. And then, of course, I'm also here as a parent. I have a child in a traditional district school, and I have a child in a charter school, and I'm endeavoring to show up as best I can as a parent so that they can become their best people. And I have worked in public education for so long now that the opportunity to apply what I have learned and what I have done in other settings to where I live is deeply meaningful to me. So I'm grateful to be part of this conversation and share this time with everybody else here. I will popcorn it to you, Jim.
Thank you, Leah. On the compass, I would position myself in the same way that Michelle did, in the believing and acting spaces. I believe that access to a good education is a human right. To me, it's a matter of justice. It's a justice issue. In my day job, I work on improving access to justice for low-income people. And I think that this mission of ensuring a good education for everyone in the District of Columbia is a matter of justice. I focus on the acting space because ultimately this board is going to have to make decisions about a new framework. I understand we're not making decisions today. This is not a meeting where we'll vote, but this is not an academic exercise. It's very real. It's an exercise that will have real consequences for charter schools and for the people of the District of Columbia. So that's why I'd put myself in the acting space as well. There are two aspects of my identity that are important to the conversation today. The first is I am the beneficiary of a good education. at every level, elementary school, high school, college, and law school. I understand the importance of a good education to good life outcomes and to one's ability to be a contributing member of one's community. And second, I'm the beneficiary of the circumstances of my birth. My biggest break in life is something I had nothing to do with. It was being born the child of Margaret Dugan and Ed Sandman. I had nothing to do with that. My parents came from very modest backgrounds, but they were able to get good educations themselves, and they stressed the importance of education to their 5 children. So that's a privilege, and I'm both very conscious of it and grateful to my parents. But that was the accident of my birth. No one's right to a good education should depend on the accident of their birth. I'll turn it over to Nick.
Thanks so much, Jim. Thanks, Leah. Yeah, you know, I guess I'll mix it up a little. I can definitely see believing and acting because I just see the importance of both of those things. And I'm here because of belief, but I'm drawn to looking at thinking and feeling. They're opposite ends of the compass. But I think if I think about this framework, I see sort of a kind of tension between those two. Although, as a mentor of mine likes to say, whenever you want to use the word balance, you should try instead to use the word combine. How do you think about combining the analytical work of sort of just, there's a lot of detail here in the framework we're going to get into, and you actually have to get all that right. But then there's the feeling and the question of how it actually impacts people, and making sure that you've got that right as well. And so I'm hopeful that our conversation can combine those two things in the way that we talk about stuff today. In terms of identities, there are a few I think that I bring in here. Also a multiracial American of Hispanic, Latin, Asian American, Pacific Islander descent, a first-generation American, a child of immigrants. Those immigrants happened to be the first in their families to go to college. So as you can imagine, impressed upon us the value, importance, imperative, shall we say, of education. And so in the same way that Jim describes privilege, I think I have that privilege too, right? Of kind of having parents who made sure of that and agree that, you know, that is something that is an accident of birth and something which we're really lucky. Leah, I've heard you talk before about let's not use the word privilege, let's use the word inheritance. We all benefit from the inheritances we've gotten from our forebears. And I think a lot of our work is about making sure that's an inheritance that's available to everyone and not just some people. Lastly, I am a parent in a multiracial family, and a person whose kids have benefited from literally every single part of DC's sort of pre-K through 12 education system, traditional schools, charter schools, the special education system, some of the out-of-school programs like Early Stages and Strong Start. All of those are things that have benefited me and us. And again, thinking a lot about how to make sure that inheritance is available to everyone and all families in DC. Looking forward to the conversation. I will pass it on to Chantel.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am in the believing and thinking portions of the compass. Believing because I believe strongly in the work that we do and what happens specifically in DC and in the charter sector and the changes that it makes in children's lives and to our city as a whole. And then thinking because I really want to make sure I understand all perspectives and that we're thinking about the impact of the decisions that we're making, the changes that will come, how this will impact schools, the leaders, the children, the families, et cetera. So I'm definitely in those two quadrants. In terms of identity, I'm coming to this as a Black woman raised by a single mom in poverty who understands the power of a quality education and the world that it opens up. It changes your world, absolutely and completely. I'm also coming as a Black woman who lives in Congress Heights on Southeast DC, a part of the city where the impact of low quality education hits hard and marginalized people have big, very historic and unnecessary suffering and social strife. So I'm always thinking about my local and surrounding community. And then I am definitely coming here as a charter school founder and a former school leader who was impacted by a new accountability framework. And I understand what that does to schools as they have to adjust and what that means in the middle of a really, coming out of a pandemic. But even if you aren't coming out of a pandemic, what it means to have to respond to an accountability framework and change and what those nuances bring. So I'm definitely bringing that identity to this conversation, and it will show up today. And Ricardo, turn it over to you to close us out. Uh-oh, you're on mute, Ricardo.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So looking at the framework, I'm coming into this conversation really guided by the heart. I often am guided by the heart, for better or worse. I lead from the heart. And I'm also thinking about the acting components and how we make this actionable in a way that is simple and straightforward for our schools, but also meaningful in terms of accountability. So that's how I fit there. And I'm guided by, advice that I got from my father long ago, just in terms of the importance of education, the value of education, and that education being the one thing, the one credential that you can have that nobody can ever take away from you as a really strong and important resource in your life. I come into this conversation as a multicultural woman and immigrant who became a US citizen when I was 26 years old. My father came to the US with $5 in his pocket. And so we definitely were not well off as I was coming up. And really, I was a product of public education from middle school through high school and all the way through my PhD. I'm also the parent of 3 teenagers who have been involved in traditional charter and private schools in the Metro DC region. I've been working in a variety of different sectors throughout my career, including higher education, government, nonprofit, and the corporate sectors. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
Thank you, board members. It is always an opportunity and a treasure really to hear how people are entering conversations. I heard a lot of believing, I heard feeling, I heard thinking, I heard acting, and it is just important for us to settle where we are entering the conversation to make sure that we're in a position to really hear each other. So thank you for being willing to engage in that way. We are going to also honor the agreements and meeting norms that we follow. The 4 agreements also comes to us from Courageous Conversation, and it's an opportunity to really commit to us staying in the dialogue, even when it gets tense and even when it's easy. And so you'll see here, stay engaged, experience discomfort, speak your truth, and accept and expect non-closure. And I would say I am certainly going to lean into that last agreement because we won't solve everything in 2 hours. And again, this is not a meeting set up for the board to vote, but I do think it would be an opportunity for us to have a really robust conversation. And I know that this board is well-versed in using I statements and focusing on listening respectfully and actively. So we will jump into our conversation today. I do want to note that because we do have a lot to cover and a limited time, our Chief School Performance Officer, Melody Sampson, might gently nudge and remind us of the time that we have and ask us to move along. And so she will help me with keeping time as we go through this conversation. Our work, as you know, as an authorizer isn't easy, but we do have the collective duty to make sure that every student in our community receives a quality education. And there are a number of ways that we think about what quality means. Of course, the accountability framework is what we're here to talk about today, but it is one of a set of tools that we have in our oversight work. And you'll see here represented the number of ways that we think about accountability broadly in the organization, and that is making sure that there is organizational effectiveness and financial health. We do our financial analysis. We also think about compliance related to schools. And so just really wanted to make sure, not necessarily for our board here, but that the public is reminded that this is one of the many ways that we think about accountability broadly. Next slide, please. One of the questions that we continue to get is, why does PCSB need an accountability framework? And it is a best practice across authorizers to have systems of accountability where we're looking at the performance of schools. You'll see here the National Association of Charter School Authorizers offers guidance to schools that, while it is important to consider the feedback that we get from stakeholders when we are developing the tool, that ultimately we must ensure that our framework maintains rigor and hold schools to high standards. So as we think about continuing, as Chair Cruzy mentioned, the long history of strong accountability in DCPCSB, we want to underscore that this framework is primarily a tool for you as the board to make school oversight decisions. And we are not oblivious to the fact that it does have value to our general public in terms of how folks communicate about the quality of schools. It does help inform school choices that parents make. And it does also signal our strong commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And ultimately, it is a tool designed for you to be able to make decisions primarily around school expansions, where we might want to have conversation about where interventions might be necessary, etc. Next slide, please. I did want to spend just a little bit of time talking a little bit about the theory of action behind the revision to our performance management framework. The revising the accountability framework supports our overall and overarching vision that every DC student receives a quality education that makes them feel valued and prepares them for lifelong learning, fulfilling careers, and economic security. And I thought it was important to speak out our vision when we're thinking about this work, because there is a natural tendency for us to dig into the technical details and the mechanics of the framework, which we will have time to do. But ultimately, this is all in service of meeting our vision and executing against our mission. We do fundamentally believe that schools should produce equitable outcomes for all of our students, ensuring that students from historically marginalized groups receive a quality education and are not left behind. And so when we looked at our performance management framework, while we were considered a national leader in that work, we also knew that as it was designed, it was not designed to consider student group performance in the way that we think is necessary at this particular time. And so in order to facilitate the expectation that we do focus on our historically marginalized groups, the revised accountability framework will include more visibility on the students who are furthest from opportunity. We will recommend a framework that reports disaggregated data by race and ethnicity and other student group factors. We recognize that it would be important to have more distinction between the levels of performance across our schools, because if you will recall, in our three-tier system, there was a large variety of range of performance, I should say, of schools that were primarily in our tier 2. And we believe it would be important to have even more distinction on the performance of the schools within our portfolio. You will see a recommendation when it does come to you that increases the bar for proficiency, and you will see, as recommended by many experts, a greater emphasis on growth in response to the impact of COVID-19. It is our hope that with all of these ways of bringing greater visibility and understanding about how our schools are performing, that it contributes to a community of schools that produces greater outcomes. Now, we know that just reporting and measuring results alone does not lead to improved outcomes. But if you go to the next slide, we wanted to share a little bit about what we anticipate the changes in the framework will produce. So we anticipate that schools and support systems having this greater visibility into both the bright spots and areas where intervention is needed will have a sense, an assessment of where we are, and can make the appropriate investments that will lead to improvement over time. And this is not just effort on the part of our schools, but on the partner organizations and agencies that support their work. With them also having greater visibility on where we are, they can readjust their investments and resources to better support schools. I'm clear that it's not our role as the authorizer to deliver direct improvement supports to LEAs, but I have and will continue to advocate with those education partners and other agencies for the resources that are necessary to do this work. I've already begun some conversations with city leaders and anyone who will listen to me about the need for this type of support, particularly for our charter schools, but in the broader education ecosystem, to make sure that we have the right resources directed toward improvement over time. We've learned a few things from the pandemic and we are still learning. So I want to acknowledge that this work is ongoing. We plan to reflect, iterate, and continually improve on the framework with our primary focus on equity moving forward. But that said, the improvements that we are suggesting that we make right now will better position us with these insights on student performance at the student group level to have more information about the effects of the pandemic and to continue to learn and grow about what is necessary to ensure that we meet our vision. Next slide, please. I want to share a little bit about the sort of design principles and the guiding principles for this work, because it is our hope that this framework is designed, understood, and embraced in such a way that eventually the majority of our schools will choose to adopt it as its goals, similar to what we have with our performance management framework. So a few things that I want to point out about the design principles. We have throughout this process considered multiple perspectives in developing this work. We've listened to all of our stakeholder groups. We spent considerable time with our LEAs. We've surveyed families and staff and board members to get a sense of both the philosophical and technical aspects of this framework. We were committed, as I mentioned before, to increase visibility, to more rigor than our performance management framework. And ultimately, we will continue our long track record of having a research-informed and technically sound tool. And the guiding principles, which you are most familiar with as a board in naming these along with staff and that we have shared throughout this process, is that we want a tool that will hold each school accountable for ensuring that all students meet or exceed high performance and or improvement targets, that ultimately an excellent school is equitable, and we want to make sure that our system does recognize that. We want to reward high levels of growth for all of our students. And I think the guiding principle that continues to be the one with the most tension is making sure that we provide a rigorous and attainable benchmark to measure our schools. And so you'll hear a little bit about those tensions and the struggles about that as our Director of Accountability and Data speaks in a few moments. And then lastly, our job as an authorizer is to focus primarily on outcomes, and those outcomes are both performance and school climate measures. We know that inputs matter, but as we think about our role as an authorizer, ultimately we are in a contract with our schools on their ability to meet their goals, and those goals are around student performance outcomes. And so those are both the guiding and design principles for this work, and you will see those in the backdrop of every decision that we have made thus far in the process. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Kirsten James, who is our Director of Data and Accountability. She'll walk us through an overview of the framework, and then we will have some time for discussion. Please note that today's discussion will only focus on a few topics of the many that we could talk about for the framework. We are going to specifically focus on the inclusion of mission-specific measures. We're going to have some conversation about student group performance, and if time permits, we're also going to talk about the recommended changes to our adult education framework. We will convene again next month to discuss additional topic areas, and those include the options for scoring and future reporting on the summative performance of our schools. So just want to level set that we're only going to talk about a few things this evening. So I will turn it over to Ms. James.
Thank you, Dr. Walker-Davis. Good afternoon, board members. My name is Kirsten James. I'm the Director of Data and Accountability in the School Performance Department. I am also in the believing space on the compass. I identify as a Black woman, a first-generation college graduate, a data-driven educator, a DC resident, and a bonus mom to a public charter school student. So all of those things are I bring with me as I enter this conversation. Earlier this year, NACSA published a guide for performance frameworks to explain the importance of frameworks and to help authorizers develop and implement high-quality performance frameworks. They say that the most critical job of authorizers is setting expectations for and evaluating how students are doing. It is important to note that academic frameworks comprise student outcomes, while other tools evaluate adult inputs. So you are all familiar with DC PCSB's performance management framework, or PMF. Some of you know it from the school leader perspective, some as charter school parents, and some as board members. These are the notable revisions we intend to propose in the revised accountability framework. Moving from 3 tiers to 5 levels will provide a more meaningful distinction between schools' performance. Using the state floors and targets means that the standards of performance are based on all public schools in the city and not limited to the charter sector. Chronic absenteeism will replace in-seat attendance in the school environment category. We intend to propose removing the PARCC 3+ measure and calculating the PARCC proficiency and growth measures by grade band, which accounts for the difference in performance at the elementary and middle school levels and supports differentiation for standalone middle schools. In response to feedback from adult schools, we intend to propose the revised accountability framework exclude in-seat attendance and expand the earned certifications measure beyond the 6 high-level certifications DCPCSB historically approved. Does anyone have any questions or comments about any of these proposed revisions? My next slide will introduce some of our new elements, but these are just the revisions to what you knew as the performance management framework.
Thank you for this, Kirsten. I have a couple of questions. Can you, because some elements here are pretty technical and will make most sense to those who are familiar with the technical aspects of some of this. Can you, I'll begin by asking you to explain what the difference is between chronic absenteeism and in-seat attendance and why we'd make those changes. I'm interested in hearing why the removal, what is PARCC 3+, what are we replacing it with? And what do you mean by the different grade band elements? I actually do know it, but I want you to be able to explain it. Okay. And why in-seated, the replacement for the adult education framework and why in-seat attendance kind of matters there.
Okay. So first, the chronic absenteeism and in-seat attendance. In-seat attendance is calculated by the sum of days students are present in a school year out of this total sum of instructional days. And it is a cumulative and very large calculation, if I'm being honest. So at the school level, it's added up as all of the days that all of the students are present in a school year out of the total number of instructional days they could have or should have been present. And chronic absenteeism is calculated by the percentage of students whose in-seat attendance rate is below 90%. So basically the percentage of students who have missed more than 10% of the school year. Now, the difference is when you're calculating in-seat attendance, students who have really good in-seat attendance, which we have a lot of students who come to school every day and have a, between 95 and 100% in-seat attendance, it often masks when there are students who have really poor attendance or are chronically absent. And so when you identify the percentage of students who are falling below that 90% threshold, there's more visibility into the students that are struggling with attendance at a school. Additionally, chronic absenteeism is measured based on any absences and not just unexcused absences, where in-seat attendance is unexcused absences. So it is particularly focuses on students who are missing instructional time. That's number one. Removing PARC 3+. So 3+ is PARC has 5 levels. Levels 4 and 5 are designated as proficient, and level 3 is approaching proficiency. Previously, it was a measure that was included in the performance management framework, and we intend to propose removing it as a measure. There's a couple of things to note. One is when you measure PARC 3+ and PARC 4+, which we previously had both, you're double counting students. So the students who got 4 and above are counted 2 times. The second thing is there's a lot of research about PARC, and but some recent research, probably within the last 5 years, suggests that PARC proficiency at each grade level is a strong indicator of whether a student is on track to college readiness post high school. So if a student is meeting proficiency as early as 3rd grade, that is a predictor of meeting proficiency in subsequent years and success beyond high school. So that's why we intend to propose that. The PARC proficiency and growth measures being disaggregated by grade bands is important because previously with the PMF, we had a pre-K to 8 framework. And so all of our floors and targets and standards of performance were based on the range of 3rd graders through 8th graders. For schools that serve students in 5th and or 6th grade through 8th grade, their performance is wildly different, if I'm being honest, than a student who's a first-time test taker in 3rd grade. And so narrowing the grade bands is in response to ensuring that those schools are getting the most appropriate standards of performance that they can be evaluated against.
That's kind of to Dr. Walker Davis's point of being able to highlight where great things are happening and opportunities.
Exactly. And when you combine such a large range of grade levels, a lot of that gets muddled because it's just kind of leveling for everyone. And also, you're not necessarily being compared to like schools, if you will, or like grade levels. And then for adult education, in-seat attendance is a measure that is primarily for students of compulsory age, generally. It had been part of the adult framework. They had in their framework, they had 2 kind of similar measures. One was in-seat attendance and one is persistence. They agreed and shared with us that persistence is a more appropriate measure for their students, because in order to be present, fully present, and complete programs at the adult education level, being in a seat, like present in the classroom every day of the 180-day school year is not a measure of success for the program. So a lot of their programs have certain number of seat hours in order to achieve a certification, or only require the student to complete, certain assignments or anything like that in a virtual setting maybe, but in-seat attendance was not a strong indicator of student success at the adult level. And so that's why we intend to remove that from their framework. And we will maintain the persistence measure, which basically measures students starting and completing a program.
Okay, thank you for walking us through that. I'm compelled, for me, back to the compass and the reason why I find this work so important and the unique role of the authorizer in this theory of change of charters being the most promising governance method to improve learning outcomes for young people. This proficiency piece of when I think about a young person who leaves our system, they and their family are choosing a school because they believe that school's unique model is going to meet their needs so that they are on a path to, once they exit the system, to build the life of their choosing. Mm-hmm. And proficiency doesn't even mean that you are at the 99th percentile. That means that you is an indicator that you are equipped with the skills that you will need in whatever that content area is. So that seems important. I get that. And I also thank you for explaining the disaggregation piece that it seems that this is going to be incredibly important to provide insight for school leaders and the board of schools to really understand where their school is performing in service to different subgroups of students. My last question, because I know we need to go on, there's so much more, is the bullet about calculating proficiency and growth measures by grade bands. What about the grades that aren't 3 through 8? What about in the compulsory grades? What about 9 through 12?
So for Park is only also at the high school level, it's generally 9th and 10th grade, but it's Algebra 1 and Geometry and English 1 and English 2. And so those are not factored in anyway, because they are in a separate framework altogether.
Got it.
Other questions or comments before we move on?
Just a quick one from me. Why go to the grade bands? I read the justification, but if you could explain like why grade bands instead of individual grades now?
So most of our schools serve grades, like ranges of grades. And so at a school that serves, we generally have schools that are pre-K or pre-K to 5. And then the idea of standalone middle schools is an ongoing kind of debate, if you will, but they are uniquely positioned by serving that group of students. And those are students who have tested for several years in a row, and their performance just shouldn't be combined with the lower grade levels. And so even schools that serve kindergarten or pre-kindergarten through 8th grade will still get both scores, because these elementary middle schools are often treated separately, like, a middle school campus, and sometimes have other administrators versus elementary school students. So it's to accommodate how schools are configured, basically.
Great, thank you.
Harrison, given the time, I'm going to go ahead and skip you along to the new elements of the revised accountability framework.
Perfect. Okay, so here we go. These are the proposed new elements in the revised accountability framework. The addition of mission-specific performance, which we will discuss further during this meeting. The opportunity for schools to earn bonus points for performance on a school-selected nationally normed growth assessment. The addition of growth to proficiency which is a criterion reference growth measure, will be added or is going to be proposed to be added alongside median growth percentile for the pre-K to 8 framework. And lastly, the pre-K to 8 and high school frameworks performance on all the measures will be disaggregated by student groups. And we will also talk about that proposal later in this meeting as well. Okay. So instead of a full list of measures and weights for each framework, these charts give a high-level overview of how the 100 points are distributed across the categories. Most of the points in the pre-K only framework come from the class assessment, which measures student-teacher interactions. And that's in the top left corner. Aligned with NACS's guidance on guidance and input directly from schools, the pre-K to 8 framework prioritizes growth within the school progress category, which is weighted heaviest. The high school framework school performance category comprises more than half of the total points because it includes post-secondary readiness measures, formerly Gateway. And based on feedback we got during a task force meeting back in September, the school performance and school progress categories are nearly equally weighted in the adult education framework. Okay, during this discussion time, I will share some information about the topic and then provide you all the opportunity to ask questions and talk to each other. The first topic is mission-specific performance. An accountability framework standardizes how school quality is evaluated, but does not allow for meaningful measurement of the unique components of a school. NACS's 2023 guidance emphasizes the importance of these measures. By adding mission-specific measures to its framework, DCPCSB is responding to the needs of our portfolio of schools and aligning with the national shift to using mission-specific measures for formal accountability. In March, we administered a survey to the accountability task force members, and more than 70% agreed with adding mission-specific measures to the framework. 14% disagreed, and less than 16% were undecided. Of those who agreed, some said they needed more information and some said it should be optional. We are proposing that the mission-specific performance measure be worth 10 points in the framework. And in the model that the models that we've done, we assumed that schools got 8 of those 10 points based on some calculations we've done of schools' attainment of mission-specific goals in prior years. So roughly 80%, almost 81% of schools with individually negotiated goals were met from 2016-17 through 2018-19. So the working model assumes 8 of 10 points. So the most prevalent concerns referenced giving away points and the possibility of mission-specific measures lacking rigor. So I want to talk a little bit about DCPCSB's experience with mission-specific measures. This is not a new concept for us. In our current portfolio, 20 LEAs have individually negotiated goals and academic achievement expectations in their charter. Among those are elementary, middle, and high schools, adult education schools, and schools eligible for the alternative accountability framework. Another 8 LEAs are evaluated based on both PMF scores and school-specific goals. Since the launch of the adult education PMF, schools have had the option of displaying mission-specific goals on their school quality reports, acknowledging there are measures unique to a school's program that weren't otherwise captured in the PMF. While we have experience measuring mission-specific performance, it'll take time to ensure each school has an appropriate mission-specific measure and target in the accountability framework. This timeline shows that staff will spend the next 2 years taking the necessary steps to successfully implement this new framework component. After standards of rigor are defined in the Charter Schools Policy Part 2, staff will begin collaborating with LEAs to define reliable and valid measures that adequately capture student outcomes related to their mission and set rigorous attainable targets. During this time, the 10 points allocated to mission-specific performance will not be included in the framework. In other words, there will only be 90 possible points for schools to attain. Questions? Comments?
Before we get to board member questions, I just want to say that I'm excited about all of the revisions to the framework, but I am very excited about the possibility of mission-specific goals being included, because we heard a lot, and I recognize the ability to have a consistent way of measuring all of our schools, but also recognize like why we chartered 69 LEAs to do the unique things that the 69 LEAs do. And I think this is really an opportunity to allow them to identify goals and measures that will represent that work. It is not a whole half the framework, but is a significant amount of points that we can really try this. And I would say that if we get this right, we will continue to set the standard for many other authorizers who will get this right. And I think we will learn a lot, as will the LEAs, about what it means to measure the unique thing about their charter. So I do want to hear board questions for us, and Kirsten and others will be available to answer.
Kirsten, you mentioned having gotten feedback about rigor, about how do you ensure rigor in determining what an appropriate mission-specific goal is in the first place, and how you measure whether that goal has been met. Can you elaborate on the response to those concerns? What we're moving to here is a system where there will be a lot of variety. Every school will have its own mission-specific goals. And I think we should be looking for not only rigor, but consistency of application and measurability, so that we don't end up in a situation where, as a practical matter, the school is evaluating its own performance and determining whether or not it met its mission-specific goals. I don't think the evaluated should also be the evaluator. So can you respond to those concerns?
Absolutely. So far, we've only decided that the indicator must be focused on student outcomes. That's the only thing that we've committed to at this point, but schools will take the lead in determining what these goals and measures are. And we as authorizers will set the criteria for determining the credibility of the school's proposed measure and or the assessment or tool and approve it. So some of the ideas that have come up around how we intend to set those criteria are whether or not the tool is an externally validated tool. Is it an assessment that the school made up themselves, or is it something that is has reliability and validity tests that have been done on it already? Is it something, kind of what you said, is it something that they can give themselves as much credit as they want, or is it something that can actually be measured? And I think that is one really important part. Recently, I heard from the SUNY authorizer about a logic model for identifying mission-specific measures. So it's kind of an exercise that schools go through to really identify their secret sauce, if you will. And so, and get to a point where they can really nail down something that will measure that accurately and reliably. And then we get into the business of setting rigorous and attainable targets to ensure that schools are pushing themselves in that specific area. And then once we come to an agreement of all that, and it will be decided. But that is also part of the reason that we're giving ourselves this time, because the negotiations we do anticipate will take some time.
How much guidance do you anticipate being able to give the LEAs at the outset? Because otherwise, if you don't have clear guidance, here are the standards. So they don't walk into the negotiations starting a conversation. They've given a lot of thought to guidance they've received in advance. Otherwise, if you're with all the LEAs, you could be talking negotiating well beyond what you're showing on this schedule here.
Absolutely.
So how much guidance do you anticipate being able to give when?
Yeah,
Well,
I want to first just name that the charter goals policy that we will have in front of you in the fall is going to be sort of the foundation of how we negotiate goals with all schools. And as Kirsten mentioned, we will also have very specific guidance about the mission specific piece of it, but you could talk a little bit more about the mission specific piece, Kirsten. I just wanted to mention that this is not going to be in a vacuum outside of how we would do goals negotiation in a robust way as well.
Thank
right.
you.
So part of charter goals policy part two that you will vote on in winter will define those standards of rigor. It's an effort to refine and provide the necessary guidance for individually negotiated goals in general, right? Like we have guidance that currently exists when a charter is written, and we have a goal specialist on my team that negotiates with schools to ensure that when they change their goals, they are rigorous and attainable. But we want to codify those standards as part of Charter Goals Policy Part 2. And so they will follow, these mission specific measures will follow the same criteria as if it were a standalone mission specific goal in a school's charter.
Thank you.
Kirsten, I have a question for you. So I see that right now, the way that it is going to be, it's going to be 90 for now, because until we roll out, will all schools be required to have a mission specific goal? And then what happens? Oh, oops. Well, y'all know anyway. What happens if they don't have, if what they already do is encompassed in the revised accountability framework, right? So a college prep school, and there might not be anything so unique about the mission of the school. What happens to those LEAs?
So great question. And an idea that has been floated is that those schools can just reallocate the points to a measure that already exists, right? So if you are a college preparatory school and we, something that you do really well is get students accepted to college, right? And you're a high school, you can reallocate your 10 points to college acceptance, which is a high school measure. It is important for us to recognize that the way the framework is set up might align directly with some schools' missions, and they shouldn't necessarily have to create something new if what they intend to do is already captured in the framework. So basically, they would still get the points, they would just move them into a measure that already exists.
And I guess then following up on Jim's comment around will we provide guidance and standards for that? Like, do schools, will they be able to just decide themselves where those scores go? Will they have to do it in advance, right? Because obviously I'm a school, I'm missing, oh, wow, I could really use some proficiency points I get to put there, right? Like, what would that look like? Will we provide standards and guidance for that as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. And while it is not all laid out or defined at this point, I anticipate that we will, similar to how we do individually negotiated goals, once you identify it, that's what it is. You can't decide during the year, like, hey, I don't really think we're going to meet that thing that I said we were going to do. Let me switch it over to something else that we're probably going to do better in. That it is still contractual in a sense. So once you commit to that, that's the one that you're going to use. And if you intend to change it, we would go through the same negotiation process we would if it were an individually negotiated goal.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions on mission specific goals? while I recognize we're not voting tonight, it seems that there is interest in us figuring this out. And I just want to circle back to Board Member Wright's question about what if the school doesn't have it. I do think that it is important for us not to make this optional so that we all, us and the LEAs, get better at being really clear on what is the unique contribution that our schools are making. And even if that unique contribution is already aligned to our framework, then let's actually assign the points associated with that, with those spaces. So I think it's an important commitment for us to make, and we all will collectively learn and get better at doing this. But to me, I am of course concerned about the capacity that it will take to do this and what this means on our staff, but we as a staff are committed to doing it, and we'll have all of the necessary guidance going forward.
Yeah, and two quick comments from you before we move on, Dr. Walker Davis. One thing I would say is, I think the solution around allowing schools to choose one of the existing kind of, well-validated measures I hope will help with that, at least in the short term, right? As you say, it's not that every single school, every single LEA has to come up with their own measure right away, but they have options out the gate. The second thing I guess I would say is, I think I've been hearing a lot of feedback around from various forums I've been in around the need for some flexibility around schools being different. We have a diversity of schools. And so allowing for 10 points in the framework to reflect that diversity, but to still do it in a rigorous way is a really, really important thing for us to do, right? So the framework is still quite a unified framework. You have to generally be good at the same things in order to do well on it, but it gives some flexibility there. And I think this strikes the right balance.
And I would agree with Nick. I do want to, though, just underscore, I would not want us in the unintended consequence of recognizing those differences also then put a pressure on schools to create false measures so that they can check that box and say that they have a unique mission specific. And I'd also want those schools who don't necessarily have a mission specific goal to not feel like they are penalized or judged less because their model and framework aligned. I mean, their model and their way of being aligns with our framework. That's actually good, right? Some schools just getting children to learn, right? Like it's the thing that they need to do and do well. And so I want to also make sure we balance and watch closely for that. I'm confident in your Chris, Kirsten, and the team to really think it through. But that's the lens that I will also come with. But I do think it is real value in highlighting the differences among all our different LEAs. And if people really want to highlight that and have that shown in the framework, I agree with you, Dr. Walker Davis, that finding space for that is very powerful and important.
Thank you. Kirsten, let's move along because I suspect that student groups will have more conversation.
Yes, it will. I will again reference recent guidance from NACSA on disaggregating outcomes by student group. Evaluating student group performance assists authorizers in holding schools accountable for educational equity. So this slide, from January to March, we presented more than 50 pre-K to 12 framework models to the task force. We have grappled with the most equitable way to measure student group performance with a portfolio of schools with various demographic compositions. This chart shows the three main approaches we attempted. So we spent a lot of time on approach number one, which was static weights. So we adjusted the weights several times and settled on the ones listed here. With this approach, at-risk student performance weighs the most, prioritizing the performance of one of the sector's largest historically marginalized groups. Racial and ethnic groups are equally weighted across all schools. In other words, Black student performance weighs the same at a school if it's 99% Black or 13% Black. This turned out to be a pro and a con. When the N size of a student group is small, each individual student's performance weighs more than their counterparts of the groups with larger N sizes. And so that was a challenge. And when weights are static and you don't have enough students in that particular student group, those points disappear. They no longer exist. And so we found that sometimes when that happens, there's disproportionality or the variations in weights for measures and or categories kind of gets jumbled. So I will give an example of that. We had a school where they have at-risk students in 3rd grade, but they don't have at-risk students in 4th and 5th grade. Okay, so when we were measuring proficiency, which includes 3rd graders, we had at-risk student performance, and that weight was accounted for. When we were measuring growth, which is only 4th and 5th grade, we did not have at-risk performance available. And because that makes up such a large portion of the points, it looked like we were weighing proficiency heavier than growth because those points didn't exist. If that makes sense. And so that message was not, that was an unintended consequence. We were not intending to say proficiency weighs more than growth, but because this particular school didn't have at-risk students in those areas where we were measuring growth, those points were not available. And so that became an issue. And as we were working with Mathematica's regional educational laboratory, they kind of talked us through, like, what does that mean? What does it mean when you have small n sizes of students and static student group weights, and how an individual student's weight shifts with that dynamic. The second thing that we tried was having student group weights be kind of dictated by the school's demographics. So we say, as we said in the first one, at risk is 20%, at risk is 40%, not at risk is 20%. So if the measure is 10 points, that comprises 6 points total. So we would say 6 points goes to the at-risk factor, and that would be split up based on your at-risk student group. So if your at-risk students are only 10%, then they would only get a portion of those 6 points, that small portion, and then the rest of the points would go to the not at-risk group. So one of the consequences of that is, as we entered into this and have kind of stood behind prioritizing positive outcomes for students furthest from opportunity, when you have a school that doesn't have a lot of those students, then their other students are weighted much heavier. And so that didn't really align with what we were intending to do either. So it's also dynamic in that your weight, the weight of a student group or a student's demographic indicator shifts from school to school. So if I am a Black student, my performance weighs however much Black students there are there, right? If I'm at a school that's 99% Black, it weighs that much. If I'm at a school that's only 9% Black, it weighs that little. And so it did not provide the visibility or create space for the visibility of differences in student group performance that we were looking for. So the last approach is kind of a combination of the two. And it was a recommendation from the REL that we kind of cap our at-risk. So make the at-risk status student group performance weights static. So we're still at 40 and 20. Students with disabilities is still 15. EL students are still 10. But for race and ethnicity, that one is dynamic based on the school's demographic makeup or racial and ethnic makeup. And so in that sense, if those 15% of the points, if your school is 99% Black, the full 15% of points go to Black students. If it is 5% Latino and 5% Black and 50% Latino, 50% Black, then half the points go to Latino students, half the points go to Black students. So that one is the dynamic indicator, or demographic indicator, and the others are static. As you can see, it has been very complicated. And there have been a lot of iterations and kind of toggling with what are the right percentages to use, what are the right weights to use. You'll notice that we don't have an all students group, which is generally what is used. And all students means that when you have the demographic indicators, those students are counted multiple times each time. So in this model, the at-risk and not at risk covers all of your students. And then they are only counted the additional times when they meet the other indicators like students with disabilities, English learners, and race and ethnicity. So in that sense, each student is at least counted 2 times and sometimes possibly more. That was a lot of information and possibly a little bit complicated. And I want to appreciate that and also say, I know that this is what I do all the time and not what everybody else does all the time. So please ask all the questions you need to, and I will explain as much as possible.
So, I see Dr. Walker, were you going to say
I was
something?
just saying questions, that's all.
Okay, so I have 2 questions, Kirsten. So the first is what, so everyone is clear, right? Like even thinking about this kind of student group weight, what do we want to be able to know about our sector or an individual LEA by even collecting this data? So that's my first question. Like why even do this? What do we want to know?
Dr. Walker Davis, you want to go or you want me to go?
You will have a more robust response, but I will say that as I was engaging with this opportunity to be the ED, I was sent a whole lot of data about PCSB, and I was looking at our performance management framework, and I said to myself, where's the data on student group performance? Because it's not enough for me to see overall performance. I want to know that even in a school, I think we can jump to conclusions when we see low overall performance in a school that something is not working in that school. But we also jump to assumptions when we see high performance in a school that everything is working. And so to me, disaggregating by student groups allows us to have visibility on how individual schools are serving all of the students that they are educating, and to what extent there are opportunities for celebrating and rewarding those schools, and to what extent we need to be paying closer attention. And so when I think about what Kirsten just explained about schools with smaller populations and larger populations of student groups, if we don't have some window into visibility on how all students are performing, I think we have the risk of having a false narrative, both about schools with overall low performance as well as schools with overall high performance. So at a very base level, that is my interest. And I think our interest as a collective board in wanting to know that and wanting to know where to focus both our attention, but also the attention of all of the partners who want to provide resources and support to schools. Kirsten, you can give the more mathematical response.
No, I feel like that was great. That was great. We don't need math with that one. I mean, philosophically, it is important to see how different groups of students are doing. Like different groups of students have different needs, right? Even more specifically, when we're talking about English learners and students with disabilities, how are those students faring in your population? When you have, and I would echo what Dr. Walker Davis said about higher performing schools. When you have kind of consistently high performing schools, oftentimes the disparities between how their student groups are performing is masked because they maybe don't have a lot of those students, right? And so they kind of get fly under the radar, or the other students are performing that much better that it just kind of like evens it out. You don't really see it. And so that is something that's really important to me. And I also think that when we have schools that serve different groups of students, right? Like the population of the school is different. I want to see how student outcomes are for students with disabilities at every school. How are at-risk students performing at every school? And I think that's really important for us to have a window into.
Okay, thank you for that. No, I using my I statements, I agree with Dr. Walker Davis. I think it is a huge step for our board to be thinking like this and being that clear about how we're looking at it. With that being said, I do have two questions though. I want to understand. So, well, this is not a question, this is clarification for this part, just to be clear. So we are going with, this is option number 3, the combo static, and then, okay.
Correct.
So can you talk to us a little bit about how you came up with these weights for these different categories? And then I'm specifically interested into why the races on race and ethnicity are combined in the way that they are.
So shout out to Holly on my team who does a lot of research and looks at how other authorizers and other state agencies are measuring student group performance. But we looked at how other folks approach it. Even OSSE, we know what theirs is intimately, I would say, to get some ideas. And we initially chose weights aligned with the sector's demographics. So our sector is 55% at risk, roughly 14% students with disabilities, 8% English learners. And so we started there. When you assign 55% of performance to at-risk students, it swings the pendulum very far in the wrong direction. And we wanted to remain consistent with the intent of creating visibility and not penalizing, right? And so we want to, and we also want to continue to on this path of prioritizing positive outcomes for students furthest from opportunity. And so we made some adjustments to those weights and we landed on kind of rounding English learners up to 10, rounding students with disabilities up to 15. And then once we had this idea of at risk and not at risk, we went from 50 down to 40, we did 35 even. So we kind of played with it a little bit, and 40 was the sweet spot where we felt like it was equitably evaluating school performance across many different types of school compositions.
And then the collapsing of the race groups.
So our students who identify as Asian, American Indian, Alaskan Native, Native Hawaiian, and other Pacific Islander, and 2 or more races make up less than 3% of our sector combined, less than 3%. And so at the school level, many schools have these students at their schools, but if we did racial and ethnic performance split up that many times, because the end sizes are so small, because you might have less than 10 Asian students at your school, they would not show up anywhere, right? It would they just wouldn't be counted. They would show up in at risk or not at risk, but then not again in race and ethnicity. And so when we combine those 4 distinct racial and ethnic groups, it makes the end sizes larger so that as a group, those other races can be accounted for in schools where their numbers are fairly low, which is most schools, their numbers are fairly low because they make up such a small percentage of the sector itself.
Thanks so much for your work on this, team. And I've been thinking a lot about this, and the principles, I think, heard from both Chantel and from Dr. Walker Davis, make a ton of sense. There's one other principle that's on my mind, and I think we've said it in various public meetings and also in our sort of closed session discussions too. This idea that the next version of this framework should reward and incentivize those schools that welcome and really support and serve those students who are most in need. And that's reflected by kind of the categories that we see here. Conversely, I've heard it framed another way, and I think it's just as important that the framework doesn't penalize those schools that kind of welcome and serve and do well with students in those groups. And so I think it's clear to me that that's what we're aiming for here. And I think there's some challenges here in terms of how we're trying to get there. And so I think with that principle in mind, I have a few questions. One is, the weighting that you've done here is to kind of form fit to 100%. Like these things all have to add up to 100%, and therefore, and then you just sort of take an average of each of the groups and then you add them up to 100. There's another way to do weighting I've kind of seen in other contexts, particularly like sort of in places outside of DC where, you know, you're doing like student funding formulas. You might say, for example, that an at-risk student, you know, gets a weight of 20%. And so it's, you know, they're like 1.2 students. Just making that up. Obviously, a student with disability might be 1.3. Essentially, the idea being that you get more credit for either growing or helping to become proficient, a student in one of those categories. And there really kind of is no limit in the upper. You don't have to kind of fit it into 100 percentage points. Is that something that you all considered as you thought about how to kind of weight and apply this principle of rewarding and then not penalizing, schools that serve these sorts of students?
Yes, thank you for asking that, Nick. It actually, several months ago, when I started working with the REL, one of the members of the REL that was talking to us about student group weighting said, well, have you ever thought about individual student group weights? And I was like, I don't know what that is. What are you talking about? And he explained it to me, and I was like, that is genius. I was like, I've solved all the problems. This is what we're doing. And at first I was like, it sounds like it'll be really hard to explain to people, right? It'll be really difficult for me to explain. And then like, how do we decide who gets what weight, right? Like, okay, we want to stick to kind of these principles that we've already identified. So we want to, weight at-risk students, but then you have like, students that fall into multiple categories. So does an at-risk student with disabilities weigh the most, or, are we, so there, that all happened, right? And we kind of put it on the back burner for a while because I was like, I don't know if we can get down with that. And then I said, you know what, I think that might be a solution. When we started with approaches 1 and 2 and saw that there were these unintended consequences of, how individual student weights were coming into play, we tried it. And when I brought it to Dr. Walker Davis, we looked at the data and I said, the one problem here is, how do we account for race and ethnicity? Because if we assign equal weights to all of the races and ethnic groups, they cancel each other out, right? Every student is 1 point. If you add 0.1 for Black and 0.1 for white, it's the same. And so because we have really said this from the beginning, that racial and ethnic student group performance was something that we wanted to create visibility into, we didn't want to abandon it on account of our approach. And so my initial response was, well, why don't we just add points for the racial and ethnic groups that make up the most of our sector, right? We have 88% Black and Latino students. And so we could add, weight for Black and Latino students. And that didn't really go over well. And so the fact that we would only be able to display racial and ethnic student group performance and not really factor it into the actual framework felt like we were abandoning one of the fundamental things that we were setting out to do. And so, yes, we have thought of it. Yes, we have tried it. I am still very open to trying to figure out if we can make it work at some point. But what I have learned through this process is that every single option has a compromise, an unintended consequence, something that we have to kind of give up or give into in order to implement it. And that wasn't something that we were willing to give up at the time. And if we could figure out how to do individual student group weights and work in racial and ethnic student group performance at the same time, I am definitely like open to rethinking that. But right now, this is where we've landed after definitely exploring an option like that. And so yeah, I'm actually really excited that you even thought of it to ask.
You said something. You said it didn't go over well. With whom? Not this committee, right? At
No,
least
no.
just suggested it, but who did it not go over well with?
I will name with me. I think
Okay,
that,
all right.
I mean, and others, but I would say really trying to stay true to our principle of making sure that there's visibility of every student that is represented in our system, even in instances where we do have low end sizes in schools. I think we do need to wrestle with, at the same time, recognizing where the majority of our student population is in the district, that we have an obligation to serve everyone. So I do want visibility on race and ethnicity and the performance of student groups in those categories, as I do every other category. And if we can find a way to honor all of those things, then we will do it, including revisiting this particular methodology of assigning additional points. But as we ran the data, it did not seem to be getting at that goal of recognizing every racial ethnic group represented in our system. And while some of them are even fewer in individual schools, that kind of approach might work at a sort of statewide level where you have many students captured, but it wouldn't honor the individual school representation. And so that's where the challenge was.
Right. Well, and just to name one elephant there, right? It's tricky and dicey to decide that you're going to put a different weight on one racial and ethnic group versus another. Although I will say, just to say it out loud, we've talked a lot about how we want race to matter more, right? And we want to elevate certain. I think the key would be, how do you find an objective standard by which to do that? Perhaps this is just something for us to think about. We could think about something like, what have been the historical differences in proficiency and performance? And that could be a rational basis for doing weighting like that. It's still provocative, I think, right? I actually don't, I'm pretty sure most weighted student funding formulas go towards socioeconomic status or something that isn't race, but is a proxy for it. But I think if we want to push ourselves, that might be something worth looking into if we're thinking about that. I think a second thing, this is a small thing on one of your comments, Kirsten, you said, does a student with disabilities who's also at risk, are they extra weighted? In a way, that is a type of operationalization of intersectionality, right? If we were to do that, which is a reason to consider it. I think if we're trying to be on the front foot about this, right, to say that when you fall into multiple categories, being overweighted because of that could be important for us to do. Last thing I guess I would say is, I think it's funny. I'm going to oversimplify here for a moment, but there are like two types of schools in my mind, right? And if you just take the category of at risk, imagine the school that serves like 80% at risk kids. They're doing all right. They're somewhere in the middle of the pack. And then imagine another school that is doing very, very well. They're a top performer in the city, but their at-risk population is pretty low when all's said and done. And I think the challenge we have is, how do you make sure the system incentivizes and rewards the right behavior for both of those types of schools? There are lots of other types, right? I'm just thinking opposite ends of the spectrum. But it strikes me that if we were to make as bold a statement as we can about saying to any school leader, like so that any school leader sees this framework and says, oh, I will have opportunities to be rewarded if I welcome more kids from different diverse backgrounds into my building, and then if I do a great job at helping with their growth and ultimately their proficiency and the other measures as well. And I'm going to get sort of more and more credit for doing that. I think the more we can just sort of operationalize that as a principle, the better. And I'd love for us to kind of think about creative ways. Maybe we take race and ethnicity, we keep it at 15%, and the other ones we do individual student weights. I think there are different combinations we could think about or test here.
And I co-sign Nick on that. Nick, I think that was very well said. I want to make sure the other half doesn't happen as well, right? And so schools that have high at-risk populations, high race-heavy populations are also not, right? Like, we don't have the unintended consequences of penalizing those schools as well. So I co-sign what he
Yeah,
said
yeah.
about both spectrums of those schools and how this looks, which I think was my trying to understand the weights that we have here too. So I think it's an area we should still keep talking about. I think the premise that Dr. Walker Davis talked about from the beginning is important, and it's one that I think can set us up to be thinking and talking about this work nationally and setting the tone in terms of what we're doing here in the city. But we don't want to also, in trying to do that, overburden or penalize schools unintentionally in our quest to be more equitable, I guess is what I'm saying too.
And I appreciate both Board Member Rodriguez and Board Member Wright for voicing that over, because it is the question that's been in the back of all of our minds as Kirsten runs through multiple ways that we could do this. And I think the challenge is each of the options, as she stated, has unintended consequences. It's what is the option that gets us closest to, as you described it, Board Member Rodriguez, the goal that we want, right? We want to incentivize good behaviors and not create an environment that those who've already made those choices are getting penalized for it. So we remain open to revisiting our current approach and testing it, but we do feel like after running a number of models that this is the closest that we've gotten to where we want to be, but appreciate you offering even another lens that we could go back and look at. Chair Cruzy, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I really appreciate all of this discussion and agree with all of it. I just wondered, Kirsten, we've got kind of an idea of the perspective perhaps of two ends of a spectrum of different school types as a stakeholder group, but wondering, and I'm thinking about our role as an authorizer. We have authorized a school for families to choose. So think about stakeholders in a more expansive way as well. And as a result of wherever we land on this is an indication from us of a signal to the public of what we feel is an excellent school, particularly for families whose students may be in a category that is farthest from opportunity, so that they will have confidence that their child will succeed in this place. So I care about the incentives for making informed school choice decisions. So can you expand at all on what we may have heard from stakeholder groups and disaggregating this beyond those two kind of ends of the spectrum?
I would say that the most prevalent concerns about student group weights come from schools that are more homogeneous and are heavy on the at-risk and heavy in a racial and ethnic group. I think that one of the challenges or one of the concerns that they previously had with the PMF was kind of what Dr. Walker Davis was saying previously, was that even positive outcomes that are happening at those schools are masked by looking like a low performing school because of who the school is serving, right? And so one of the goals has been to develop a framework that doesn't automatically assign an evaluative rating based on the demographic makeup of the school. You shouldn't be able to say that a school that is low at risk is automatically a high performing school. You shouldn't be able to say that a high at risk, a school that serves a high percentage of at-risk students is automatically a low tier 2 or a tier 3 school, right? And so that was, when I first came, that was a lot of what I was hearing about frustrations with the PMF. As we have gone through this process with advisory groups and task force meetings and surveys and engaging with you all, and it has been a constant kind of concern or thing that I'm paying attention to, of if the relationship between the outcomes of the school and the school's demographic makeup. So throughout the times we were modeling, we were also doing some kind of analysis of if a school's demographic makeup was having a significant impact on their framework outcomes. And so that also informed some of these like student group weights and to ensure that, you know, a school that is 80% at risk, right? If we are capping at 60%, excuse me, at 40%, it means that they are not being penalized for having that many more at-risk students. I mean, in all of these conversations, there have been various things that have come up. Things like, you know, can we just give points to schools that are serving high populations of at-risk students, right? Like if your school, our sector has 55%. If your school has over 55%, which is like exceeding the sector's makeup, do you just get points for that, right? Because we have been constantly looking for opportunities to ensure that these schools continue to serve students furthest from opportunity, and that other schools choose to serve them as well. And so that wasn't something that was really on the table. We actually did a lot of research in New York during reviews and renewals. Schools do get are evaluated based on enrollment, like their demographics in their enrollment. That is something that is considered. And because when someone said it, I was like, I don't know if we can do that. And so we looked into it to see if that is something that other authorizers do, a practice that other people have. And all of that to say, what we're hearing is the concern of ensuring that the narrative isn't already written based on who's at the school.
One wondering I have on that is if there's any way to set up the weights so that serving those students can help you, but actually it won't disproportionately harm you. Like obviously not being proficient is not being proficient, but it's not like disproportionately not proficient, if that makes any sense, right? So that may also be something worth looking into.
Thank you.
Other questions on student groups?
I don't have anything to add to the excellent questions that have already been asked, but I do want to emphasize my strong agreement with the comments that Michelle made at the outset here. I think it's critically important that we be able to disaggregate and to look at individual student groups. If we're doing something wrong, if we're not able to tell how we're doing easily with traditionally marginalized groups, it shouldn't be hard to figure that out. It should be something that our focus on is very clear, that leaps out from the data. It's just, I think, too important to our role in serving the city not to do that.
Jim, I agree. I also don't have any questions. As with the last section, my questions were previously asked, but I'm in fully supportive of this metrics and moving along with these and making them more transparent.
Thank you.
Yeah, Kirsten, I think what you're hearing from the board, you all as a team, because I don't want this to also just always be attached to you, Kirsten, right? Like, we are all in this decision together. Thank you for being the face. But I think everyone, I think there's agreement that it is important work. And not that you haven't done enough to continue to try, but I think it is important enough for us to continue to just, continue to see, are there ways for us to avoid some of the unintended consequences to schools. I think our schools themselves understand the power of looking at, groups, and I think schools want to be able to be recognized and incentivized and all of those things and held accountable for it. But I do think it's important for us to truly take it through as much as possible before we roll it out.
Appreciate that. Kirsten, anything more we want to share here on student groups, or perhaps we have time to talk a little about where we're headed with adult ed?
So we spoke briefly at the top of the meeting about removing in-seat attendance, and Leah, your question, or Chair Cruzy, your question kind of gave some insight to that. And so I don't know that we need to discuss it much further, but we have committed to proposing in the revised framework that we expand the earned certifications measure to include mid-level certifications. So in the PMF, there were 6 high-level certifications that had been approved for inclusion in the list that one of their measures is earned certification. So, of these 6 students who took the assessment, completed the program, took the assessment, did they earn the certification? One concern is that it's limited to these 6 certifications, and schools offer quite a bit more than that. But there are these criteria that are set, and it's based on completing 125 plus seat hours, leading to a high wage, high demand career pathway in DC, certifications that are recognized by OSSE's Office of Career and Technical Education. And what we heard from adult schools was that they offer so much more than those 6 certifications, and would be open to expanding that list. And so what we're working directly with adult schools right now to set criteria for what would constitute a mid-level certification. At one point, the request was to kind of expand it to any kind of certification. So having kind of 3 distinct levels: a foundational section, a mid-level certification, and high-level certification. And when we talked about the foundational level certifications, things came up like CPR and other kind of seemingly, like it says, foundational certifications, but they could also stand alone. And one concern there was that we couldn't necessarily verify that a particular certification that was considered foundational was in service of achieving a higher level certification, right? Is it actually foundational to something else, or are you just getting it as a standalone? So for example, like is someone getting a certification on something that has to do with cosmetics? Are they doing that in service of getting a certification in that industry? A higher level can be a salon owner or a stylist of some sort, or are they just getting a small certification that they're not going to proceed to get more certifications in service of that larger one? So with that said, we are working with adult schools now to set criteria for the mid-level certification as certifications that can be used in earning a living wage, have a certain number of seat hours required, are granted by an external body, and defining those criteria so that we don't actually have to name their certifications anymore, that we can just say, if the certification meets these criteria, it means that this student has put forth the necessary effort and will get from it what we expect in terms of work or career advancement, and add that to the high level certifications measure, which would allow for greater visibility into adult schools that are helping students or providing students the opportunity for these career changing certifications that aren't otherwise captured with just those 6.
questions there?
Kirsten, I'm curious as to what the adult schools, I mean, I think they're such a unique part of our sector, right? And I'm uniquely close, I feel close to it now because I just did a couple of their graduations. And so it's just so different in terms of the work that they do, important work that they do around our city that is really unique to us. What are their responses to these revisions or their thoughts about that? And particularly like not including foundational certifications and things like that. Like what are their thoughts?
So when they proposed foundational to us, we started talking about it, and it became clear very early on that it was difficult to name all the certifications that would meet the foundational like kind of requirements, and the idea of verifying whether or not that certification was in service of a higher certification was also something that they felt like was lost on them. What we also heard from schools was that some certifications that would be considered foundational, like a CPR certification, are sometimes not offered by the school, but are just hosted at the school. So they might host an external organization that provides the training at their school, but it's not actually offered by the school. And so would we count that or not? And so kind of the logistics and the details became pretty cumbersome early on. And so, and we also want to maintain the integrity of the measure in saying that these earned certifications, we don't want to limit to these 6 as the high level, but there are other certifications that are that don't meet the same criteria, but are close to it, that can still have similar outcomes of career changing and or career pathways and earning living wages, whereas the foundational certifications would not necessarily provide those same outcomes for students. So,
And
yeah.
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Is there, so this sounds to me, and I could be off, but this sounds sort of to me like the lift that might be accompanied to the mission specific goal. What does this look like for staff to be able to track that for our adult LEAs? And the reason why I say this is not because you all don't know your job, but I think it's important for the public to also have insight into what this looks like managing a framework of this scale, with particularly with varying types of schools. But so if you just now have expanded this earned certification, right? It could look this way at this LEA, what does that mean? And do we need to roll that out in the same way?
Right. So
before you answer, Kirsten, I just want to acknowledge how we do have a unique adult ed sector, and they have been very active in helping us think through the current performance management framework as well as the revised accountability framework. And so, yes, Kirsten will discuss sort of what this process looks like, but I feel very confident that we have the partnership of our adult ed schools in helping us figure this out, as we've had along the way. So I just really want to acknowledge that. We got very robust feedback and detailed feedback about things that we could do to improve the framework. And so I expect this to be a real partnership going forward in terms of landing where we need to land. But Kirsten, if you could talk about how you've thought about the process and how our team is going to approach it.
right. So initially, so when they first approached us, kind of the initial response from them was like, oh, we should just do an inventory of all the certifications we offer and then look at what the requirements are to earn certifications and then categorize them. And I was like, that is a no, because they have a lot of programmatic offerings, and it's like that inventorying all of those things just felt very like a massive undertaking. And so when we were talking to a couple of adult ed leaders, and I was saying, because the high level certifications have these set criteria of what it means for it to be a high level certification, that it's like a national certifying body, the number of seat hours, recognized by OSSE and their Office of CTE, that if we set a criteria, right, if we look at some of the what we would consider mid-level and get an idea of what those criteria are, right? Maybe it's not 125 seat hours, maybe it's reduced to 100 seat hours because we know that that covers a lot of them as well. Setting the criteria so that we don't have to every year go through and see what are all of the different certifications that could be, but that we set these criteria so that as long as you tell us that it meets the criteria, we know that it meets the mid-level certification measure to be included. And so that's where we are right now, is kind of doing the research to find out what the range is that we would consider acceptable for the requirements for these mid-level certifications, so that we can just define that. And then we don't have to do an inventory. We don't have to do a full audit of all the things that exist. Folks can just say, this is the certification, this is the certifying body, this is how many hours it takes, does it meet it or not? And we're done, right? And that we don't have to go, each program that they offer. And I also think that identifying those criteria can also help schools decide what kinds of programs they want to offer, if they can expand to other things that might offer certifications that would be included as well.
This is just an area where, like, listening to what you're talking about and with the workforce, like thinking about how to tie it to the conversations that are happening more broadly around workforce development, middle skills, careers that people can have, right? And some of the things that are happening in corporate America in terms of bringing in people without degrees, how we're thinking about rethinking about the skill levels needed to come in for jobs and somehow marrying those up in some meaningful way. Even in looking at some of the offerings that are happening at community colleges and kind of that collaborative piece. So I've just got a lot swirling in my head around this one because of the workforce development piece, and there's so much happening there. And that's where I would want to see some of this connection for it to really be meaningful, is that people get a certification that they go and it launches something for them.
Well, Dr. Walker-Davis, I hope that you feel like we've gotten some, and Kirsten, thank you so much for this. I hope you feel like you've gotten some helpful feedback as we begin.
Absolutely, absolutely. I do want to thank board members just for actively participating in the dialogue. This is definitely a moment where I'm leaning into expect and accept non-closure. I feel like we could be talking about these particular topics for hours, but also know that we have a few more topics to discuss with you the next time we convene in a roundtable. You've given us some food for thought, and particularly around the student groups and also capacity around the measurement the process for developing our mission-specific goals. And as you know, as board members, we will continue to engage you individually as well as in these forums and in our board meetings on these important decisions. You're not voting tonight, but we are going to take the feedback that we received as we consider how we can enhance the efforts that we have right now. I did want to just spend some time before we close out to just name and voice over that there remain multiple opportunities for us to engage our stakeholders, and we are definitely committed to doing that. We are actively involved in drafting the technical guide for the framework. These conversations will help us think about any tweaks that we need to make to the technical and mechanics pieces of that, but we intend to draft a technical guide and get that open for public comment in August and ultimately a vote, in July, did I say that correctly, team? But ultimately have our board vote on our technical guide by September. And we are looking to have even more conversations about the real policy implications of our framework in the fall with the development of our charter goals policy. So we will engage in small groups. We'll have 2 months of public comment. around the charter goals policy, but that is where we will talk about implications of the use of the framework. So I want to make sure that folks are aware of the dates that we have here, and I will correct myself by saying our technical guide is going in August and voting in October, but that we will continue to have these opportunities for engagement. Chair Cruzy, I didn't know if you wanted to give us any closing remarks as we end this roundtable this evening, but really appreciate all of the work of our staff. And as you said, Board Member Wright, Kirsten often gets the opportunity to stand in front of task force and to deliver this work. And I want to acknowledge the data and accountability team, but I also want to acknowledge all of the staff who are actively involved in getting this framework off the ground, in helping us socialize the information here, in communicating that to our various stakeholders. And so want to make sure that everyone knows that while Kirsten gets to take the good and the bad on this work, that this is absolutely a team effort, and really appreciate board support for this work as well. Chair Cruzy.
Before you go, Chair Cruzy, if I can just say something. As a board member, I want to acknowledge our board chair, Chair Cruzy, as well as executive director and our legal counsel for even like creating this. Just as someone who's also been on, I shared my identity when I came in. I am very proud of this board and staff in terms of the level of engagement that has been done with stakeholders. The leadership of Chair Cruzy working with Dr. Walker Davis to put something like this together where we are also making our thinking public to the public, right? In terms of where we are as board members, putting some reasoning behind and the decisions that have been made or are being considered. And so I just want to say to you all as leadership, thank you for this. And I'm excited for July. And I hope that this will continue to be ways in which we will show the public how we think about this work, show our school leaders that we hear their feedback, take it very seriously, and allow people to see inside and kind of behind what people think is a curtain. And I think that's just a direct reflection of your leadership here. So thank you, Chair Cruzy and Dr. Walker Davis. And team. I know a whole bunch of people went behind it, but from a governance standpoint, I want to make sure I point that out and say thank you.
Thank you.
That's kind of you. Thank you, Chantal. Board member, treasurer Chantal. Thank you, everybody, for showing up and having the incredible work that's done every day by the staff of the DCPCSB that is operating an independent agency, engaging with the public every day, with parents who have complaints and questions, with school leaders that are navigating all kinds of uncertainty, and this kind of forward-thinking work that is complicated in a complex system, all in service to young people, to students of all ages who have bright futures ahead of them and who make the choice to attend a charter school in the city. I have so appreciated the ability to zoom back and forth from very, very high levels and very personal levels to getting down into detail. And I just really appreciate everyone making the time and space and showing up and being present in this way. So look forward to more. And thank you, Dr. Walker Davis, for making this possible.
Thank you all. Have a good night, and we will see you soon.